All right, so the idea behind program evaluation is that we end up doing a lot of work in government and we want to figure out how to identify whether or not our programs are functioning or not. So oftentimes we'll start a program and we'll try and figure out like how we can change behavior, how we can improve somebody's life or some other thing. The problem is um, that in the past we haven't thought a lot about gathering data or information that would justify program expansion in any systematic way. But also, how do we perform audits of our programs to stop programs that don't work? So the point here is we're trying to figure out how to design research that will evaluate programs from a really systematic way. So most of you know about program evaluations and you can think through things critically. You just probably don't know it yet. So if as soon as you see some program, so programs are usually like public policies. Public policies usually are broad and they attempt to change behavior. Programs are usually funded, highly targeted to a specific group of people, and often include government support. So when you start looking at government programs, um, we look at what does the program do? Like, how does it function? Who does it serve? Then you'd go, well, why? Why do we have the program? What's the intended purpose of the program? Is it solving some need um, or perceived need? Is there a group out there that has asked for this sort of thing? Like, why are we doing it? When does it happen? In other words, not just when did it start and when did it end, but at what point in an individual's life do they enter a program? Like, how do we take time into consideration in terms of programs? Where does it serve? Or is it bounded by some jurisdiction? Um, is it in a certain state or in a certain city or in a school district? Like, what are the boundaries around it? Who is involved in the program? So think about this not only in terms of who does it serve, but who has power to control the levers of the program. In other words, who has decision-making authority, who started the program, who authorized it. If you're thinking in terms of a county or a city or any elected jurisdiction, did the elected official start the program? And is there some mandate that the bureaucracy do it? Or is this some program that's internal to the city or the county that's an administrative type program? Is it a federal program that's administered to the state government or through the state government? So more or less, who has authority? Who is sending resources? Are there contingencies in how you use that sort of thing? You start thinking about all the details of the program. And then also, who does it serve? Is it missing some portion of the population? Is it hitting all the people? Is it serving one portion better than the other portion? And then ultimately, like how does the program work? If you were an individual coming through that program, um, is it easy to follow? Could you trace the process of an individual applying for the program, being selected for the program, going through each of the steps of the program and coming to an outcome? On the other side too, administratively, how do we process individuals? How does that program function inside your organization? Um, how does funding work? How do each of these steps work so that the individual can change or that group of people can change? So all we have to do is ask these basic questions that I learned in like high school journalism class, like who, what, where, when, why, and how. Um, Mostly W's, but there's an H thrown in there for good measure. So as you think about programs, you start asking these questions, but you can't just sort of ramble through it. So what we want to do is set up a process to understand what is it that you want to know. Why are you doing the evaluation? Um, like what portion are you going to look at? And all of that questioning starts driving how you're going to ask the real questions of gathering data. So that's kind of why we do program evaluation. Here's some typical programs. Like we have a traffic camera light pilot program. In other words, we set up traffic cameras to monitor traffic, maybe administer tickets. But we do a pilot program to see if it works. In other words, we're not going to just buy millions of dollars of traffic camera lights before we do it. So what we do is we set up this pilot program to see if it's going to work. Well, the pilot program by definition means that we're going to see whether or not the camera is doing its job. We're going to pilot it out. This is written a couple years ago, but we do that now with body worn cameras on police officers, or we do that with You know, gosh, all sorts of software monitoring programs for cities. Now, if you have a work issue computer, you might have to log in at a certain time. It monitors your behavior. Well, we don't want to start buying lots and lots and lots of software, which costs a lot of money, if it's not going to change the behavior. So we do it on a small group of people. If we do it on a small group of people, think about what that means in terms of sampling for your program evaluation. Is that sample going to be representative of everybody else? Are we intentionally selecting a group of people who are going to perform better or worse? Like, is there bias in our sampling? And then because people are in that program, is their behavior going to change just because they know they're in that program and they know that they're being monitored? Or are they we're going to be able to assume that their normal workflow is normal, it's undisturbed? Gosh, we do all sorts of other things. Textbook rental program, take back the park basketball programs for at-risk youth, and other programs we could think of it like laws, like the 3 strikes law, or there was a cash for clunkers program. We have new like accordingly, I keep hearing rumors that the Biden administration is going to increase the electric vehicle tax credit or whatever rebate from $7,500 to $10,000 and not have a limit on number of cars that are sold. That's pretty cool. But think about that as a program. It's taking government resources, giving them to individuals to help subsidize their purchase. Who typically buys them? Where does that money go? Is it an easy process? Is it a rebate or a direct cash program? Like, all these little details kind of matter in terms of how we think they're going to affect people's behavior. So some key concepts of vocabulary, like what's a program, what's a policy? We kind of talked about that a little bit. Programs generally have resources attached to them as compared to policies. Programs also typically have support, where policies may or may not. The goal of the program is like what we intend for it to do or what change we expect it to make. And embedded in every program goal is a hypothesis. If we change this thing, then it's going to be related to a change in this other thing. So we think that changing, for that EV example, changing how much electric vehicles cost will affect or be related to the number of vehicles purchased, which we think will then later affect air quality or whatever it is. So we look at the program goal as essentially like, if I do this, then this thing will happen. That's a hypothesis. Now, an intervention is where we assume that time is happening, which it does. And if we interject ourselves, or if we stimulate that population who is our target population with some teaching or training or resource or whatever it is, we change what was going on in the status quo, we anticipate that that will create some other outcome. And that intervention is a break in, it creates a break in a trend line. So in other words, in the past, we saw this sort of thing happening. Now we've done this program, policy, intervention of some sort, and we expect something will be different. So we expect some outcome. Control is basic experimental research stuff, is like, how much can we minimize the influence of other things in order to identify whether or not that stimulus or intervention is causing a change. Now, people have said, well, what kind of control can you introduce in terms of a program? Most of the time, they're artificial controls, like allowing some people to enter and some people not to enter a program, or comparing one program to your current program to a program in another area, or a non-program in a similar jurisdiction. So let's imagine we have an economic development program in our city, but we have a comparable city with similar demographics, similar characteristics, and they don't have a program. What we might do is essentially use that as a control, that city that doesn't have the program, in order to see how much our program changes our population while their population probably doesn't change. As long as they match in some way, you can add a level of control in your program evaluation. So the other thing about programs and program evaluation is to identify what the target population is. Not all programs apply to everybody. Like for me, I never qualified for the subsidized housing because I didn't hit the income ratio right. Like I wasn't able to qualify for the loan when I was poor enough to meet the standards. And when I was able to qualify for the loan, I was too well off to hit subsidized housing. So like, Subsidized housing, for example, has a very, very specific target population that it hits. So if we're trying to understand program evaluations and how to identify whether or not the program is working, we have to really know who the program is serving and see if it's changing that population. One thing that we don't talk about a lot in program evaluations, because most of the time we're focused on an outcome evaluation, trying to see if some outcome happens because of our program. But sometimes we can look at the process evaluation of a program. And this is in some of your readings and some other things. But how a program is rolled out could also be subject to a process evaluation. In other words, did we incorporate the right people into our decision making? Did we target the right groups of people as we were planning our program? So the target population as an idea matters. Now, whether or not you measure them as an outcome, if they've made a change, or whether or not you use that concept in your evaluation in some other way, like as in terms of a process, whether or not we're hitting the right target population, you have to understand that not all programs serve everyone. Okay, internal validity we talked about in the very, very, very first lecture. And that's to say, are there other variables that are causing the change that are not related to the program? So, gosh, I think we're coming up on it again, but in the 2008 housing crash, if you're looking at who's owning homes before that time period and after that time period, and you say it's, we've increased this type of home ownership rate because of this, and you look at maybe 2004 to 2012, and you're looking to see whether or not your program was effective, well, you've got a massive confounding variable, or in other words, there's something you're going to have to control for that you can't largely control for, especially if you're dealing with housing in your program, and that's the housing crisis. And so when there are other things that could affect the outcomes of your program, you have to make sure that they're actually not causing the change and your program is causing the change. That's internal validity. Are all these different things working in a way that is understandable, or is there some other thing besides your program that's causing a change in your outcome? External validity is largely about sampling. Are you getting enough information in your evaluation to to gather a sufficiently generalizable data set that we can say, we think this program works in this case and could be applied under these circumstances. So generalizability is external validity, and that's largely about the sample. And then as you go out to evaluate programs, how you gather data, where you gather data, that sampling process matters as well. So those are sort of the key concepts. There are all sorts of different ways to measure and to set up your design for your research. A single system research design largely just follows one program to see what it's doing and look at what kind of outcome or what kind of process is being used. Single system research designs have almost no generalizability, are largely descriptive, subject to bias, and have the potential for lots of problems. But we do them all the time in program evaluations because we may not care if they're generalizable. We just want to see if City of Corona's HR rule change made a difference in that one instance. Okay, cool. Were there confounding variables or other things going on? It doesn't really matter because we just care about this program. Okay, whatever. A group research design would look at a variety of different jurisdictions, a variety of different individuals, just a variety of other people who are or organizations that were going through the same sort of programs. If we increase the number of individuals or a number of agencies or a number of organizations that are going through the same process, or select half of them to go through the process and other who don't, in these programs, then what we do is we spread the variability of all these individuals' characteristics and traits, and organizational traits and characteristics, so we can kind of control for problems by increasing the number of individuals. We increase the amount of variation, so we minimize bias. Group research designs are good for generalizability, but if you're looking at a specific program in a specific area, they might not give you the kind of detailed information that you want. Whenever we add time, this is pre-test, post-test, the best way to look at a program evaluation is to not look at an end point, but to understand how time works either in the process of the development of that program or in how it's being rolled out or how that works inside your organization or what kind of outcome happens. So one way to look at whether or not a program creates change or is working in a certain way is to look at what happened before the program or early on in the program and then really late in the program. So you do some sort of pre-test, gather data from before and gather data afterwards, and you compare the two to see what change there is. Pre-test, post-test designs require a little bit more setup because you have to think about what you want to do before you start the program. And then, or early on in the program. And then after the program's over, use that same measurement scheme so that you have comparable measures before and after. You have to use the same sort of instrument to gather data from the beginning and the end. And if you've been involved in any sort of program, you realize that programs are growing and changing over time. They're adapting to their external environment all the time. And when that happens, you may have set your goal in your program to do one thing and you realize it's not working. You wouldn't want to keep doing that just to gather data after a year. You would start moving your program towards solving the problem. And as you're doing that, you're interjecting bias in your program, which is what you want to do. You want to make your program work, but that doesn't work well on a scientific research approach. So pre-test, post-test are ideal in theory when you use the same measurement scheme at the beginning and at the end. But in reality, what happens is you set out to measure something at the beginning and your program starts drifting to be more effective. And as it's shifting where it was supposed to be going to something else, that second indicator, that second gathering of data may not even be relevant anymore. In other words, the thing that you thought was causing the change is now no longer causing the change. So if you're asking whether that thing that caused the change using the same measure, it doesn't make any sense. So the idea behind pre-test, post-test is early on gather baseline data so that later on you can make very, very similar, you can make comparisons based on the same measurement scheme. Okay. Random assignment is also really crucial in experimental design, but not very good in programs. So in public administration, we want all the people who qualify to benefit from the program. You would never sort of allow some people into the program and randomly assign some people to not be in the program, even if you had resources for them. You really wouldn't want to assign some people to not be involved in a program that's going to benefit their life. Like, well, sorry, you're going to have random assignment over here and you're going to get the program. So you're going to control group and you are the not control group. You're going to get the treatment and we're going to compare to see which one matters. Like, we would never do that, especially if it was like drug counseling or teenage pregnancy problems. Like, you would definitely want to throw all your resources at that one group to make sure that change happened. But in order to evaluate whether or not your program is working, you have to compare it to something. And the standard way to do that is to randomly assign some people to not be able to participate in your program and then measure those two groups, the non-participators against the participators, over time to see how much better off the program, or worse off, I guess, the program participants were. So random assignment causes moral and ethical problems for most program evaluations because, at least in public administration, we believe that those programs shouldn't be withheld from an individual just in order to test to see if it's most effective. But in experiments, we do it all the time. Okay. So if you're thinking about designing a program evaluation, step back from the very, very beginning and say, what are the goals of the program? You would think this is the easiest thing to figure out, right? Well, start looking at programs and looking at them inside your organization on other people's websites, other government agency websites, and it'll say, this is the Police Athletic League, and we are out, doing this thing. What they will tell you is what they do, not necessarily why they're doing what they're doing. So like for the PAL, the Police Athletic League, as well, like when I was growing up, like get police officers to come help kids learn basketball and they'll play basketball with your kids. And we spend this much money on, spending time with your kids playing basketball in this Police Athletic League. I think awesome, super cool, great. Why? Why do we want to have police officers play basketball with our kids? Like, what's the goal? Is it that our kids will become familiar with police officers and think that police officers are great people? Or is it that we want to build strong social relationships with the community and have increased levels of trust in the police department? Is it so that when the police officers arrest the kids, that the kids will know the police officer by name, or the police officer will know the kid by name? Like, is it to get information about your community? Like, are we trying to like figure out who the gang members are and like good, get insider information. Like there's all sorts of stuff like why that you just don't see on a lot of these programs. They're not explicit. They'll talk about what they're doing. And honestly, if you are running a program, most of the time, you know what your program does really well. You know that in and out. You know why that program, or you know what the program does, how many resources, how many staff. You might even hear some good feedback about what's going on. But most of the time, the hardest part is to identify what that program is actually designed to do. What are its goals? And how will we know if it's successful? So when you set a goal, you set a measurement by which you can obtain, like that's you set a standard that you want to be able to attain, and usually there are like criteria to get there. In a lot of programs, we don't have those criteria a priori before we go into an evaluation. So part of the program evaluator's job is to say, okay, it looks like the program is designed to do this. And the person who's managing the program says, oh yeah, I think this is what it really is. And you sort of like get a sense of what's going on, how those are supposed to, like what's important to this program and why we're doing what we're doing. And then we say, okay, so how do you know if it's successful? Well, we spend out all more than the amount of money that we're allocated every month. Okay, is that money being used effectively? Well, we place, 25 people in homes every month. Okay, well, is that a good use of the money or not a good use of the money? Like, is 25 a good number or not a good number? Like, they don't know. So usually most program evaluations, what we have to do is say, well, if it hits 50% of the objective, that might be a good goal. Or if it hits 20% of what it's intended to do, that's a good goal. Maybe it's 80%. But most of the time, we don't have those standards inside our organizations. So program evaluators generally have to make those up. Okay, so identifying the goal, and then how do we get it done? How are we implementing the program? So think about the process like we talked about. How is it designed? What's the intake like? Where do the resources come from? Where do they go? Like think about how it's being implemented in order to try and identify how you're going to evaluate it. And then we say, well, how could we figure out the best way to measure the success of the program or its inclusiveness or whatever it is? Is it over time by itself, longitudinal? Is it to use a comparison group and our group? So in other words, without time, just looking at outcomes, this group did it and this group didn't have the program. So let's just compare those. Or is it panel? Like in other words, let's select a whole group of organizations that have gone through the program and compare them to a whole group of people or organizations who have not gone through that sort of program and compare all of those over time. That's panel, or called cross-sectional sometimes. Cross-sectional time series, sorry. Now, after you've designed this sort of program evaluation using those as a framework, you say, well, what else could have caused those changes? Was there something that was going on in the outside world that caused that change that maybe was not related to us? So like I've given you the housing crisis one, but think about if our city was doing something, let's say our HR department was doing some new innovative telework policy and COVID hit, like kind of in the middle of our program. Like, so you were allowed to telecommute 2 days a week and you've done it for 6 months. And then COVID hit and now you're 100% telecommuting. And now as you're phasing back to 2 days a week, like how do you control for people's opinions of telework or for their efficiency of telework or whatever other metric you want to use for telework when it wasn't just your program that had changed people's opinions, perception, effectiveness of telework because the whole world had to do it and we got a whole bunch of new tools to do it. Like, I don't think I can control for COVID. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me because it was such a big intervention. But sometimes these interventions, these like things that were going on in the outside world are pretty small. We can say, I think that's actually a really small thing and it didn't affect our program in the way that it could have. So you have to think through kind of time, process, how do we design data gathering in the right way? These are all like kind of important clues about program evaluation. Now, how do we measure success in a program? What do you think? Common measures of success? Efficiency. Like how efficient were we with that? Well, if you do some reading, you'll find out that efficiency is a measure of some kind of output to effort. So maybe you want to look at costs and benefits. What's the appropriate measure? Do you want to look at the number of something that happened? the number of lives saved or the number of, fingers that weren't cut off in your machine or whatever it is. Let's use that one for an example. There is a whole website, the Office of Personnel Management, and some other people, they collect data on how much a finger is worth in an HR filing. Like if you lose a finger in a workplace thing, and each state is different. They're all comparably different. Some of them are huge or some of them are really small. If you're evaluating, let's say, workplace safety, and you want to do it based on outcome, you would count the number of adverse incidents that there were. Oh, we had this many accidents. Accident counts as, this is what an accident is. We've had 5, we've had 2, we've had 1, we've had 0, whatever it is. Okay, totally cool. But what if you did it in terms of costs and benefits and somebody loses a finger? You're like, well, that cost us this much for this claim, but overall our benefit in this HR policy has increased our productivity. Like, well, like, are we really going to monetize somebody's finger? Totally, 100%. Like, that sort of stuff just happens. So the outcome or the measure of success that you're trying to figure out really matters in your program evaluation. What is it we're actually trying to do? Output is like a product that you churn out. And you can see how these all might be different. Efficiency is sort of like how much you can do in a certain time or a certain resource. A cost and a benefit is a measure of how much the input costs to almost always fiscal or financial benefit. An outcome is like usually a count or some sort of product, but an output is like how many people are being processed through the program. An outcome is usually a longer term objective, and output is usually an annual or some shorter term thing. So let's say if we're looking at the criminal justice system and we look at outcome, we're looking to see if the people who are incarcerated change over a period of time and don't recidivate. But if we were talking about like an output, we would say we took in this many criminals and we put them to prison, and this is how many we released. That's an output. An output is usually some product, but an outcome is like a long-term objective. Okay. And then we say, well, how many of those do we need to be successful? Well, you have to figure that out. It's not ever very clear, especially if the goal is not clearly stated. In other words, to say we're doing all these things, but we don't really know why we're doing them. There's no objective. You're going to have to like make up some success criteria. Ultimately, most program evaluations do require some sort of success criteria, and that's negotiated between the consultant and the client or the internal auditor inside your HR department or whoever is sponsoring that analysis, that program evaluation. There's some negotiation between the superior and the principal and the agent in that relationship so that they can come to some agreement, because most often they're not some predetermined success criteria. And most of the time we look at outcome evaluations because that's the way we think, like what sort of change happened. But we should focus on other types. There's all sorts of them in the Program Evaluation 101 assignment. There should have been at least a couple of different pages from the EPA site and some other things about process or efficiency or inclusion types of analysis that, program evaluations that might be really, really helpful, especially if you're not looking at an outcome as your goal. If you're looking at it as a process, then you're not going to, an outcome program evaluation doesn't make any sense. I think I've shared this with you before that when I was managing a certain organization, I was hyper focused on outcomes. And I thought that's what everybody wanted. They wanted some outcomes. But what I found was the people who I was managing and was working with, they were more than willing to sacrifice efficiency and outcome for inclusion in the process. And so if I were evaluating my time as that manager, I would say I failed because I misunderstood what the goal was. I thought it was to get things done at a certain, benefit, at a certain amount of efficiency. And what they actually cared about was having a say in the process. So I can fail at process and be successful at outcome. Or I can also fail at outcome and be successful in process. So a program evaluator who has a mismatched sense of what success is in a program might design a program evaluation based on a criteria that doesn't match the goal of the program. Does that make sense? I hope so, because you can't respond. But literally what I'm saying is someone could do a very rigorous program evaluation and find that a program is successful based on efficiency. And another person could evaluate the program based on process and inclusion and diversity and find that that program is failing. How? They're measuring two different aspects of the same program. Both highly rigorous, come to different conclusions. That's why the question that you ask, what the goal of the program is, what do you want to know about it, that always drives the method that you'll use to conduct a program evaluation. A couple of things that are oftentimes at the forefront of program evaluations are fiscal accountability. In other words, did we spend the money appropriately? Did we follow all the rules? Did we spend that money on something that shouldn't have been spent on? Can we account for all that money? Fiscal accountability. Process accountability is, did we perform our task properly? Did we follow all the right steps? Even if the outcome is wrong, was the process right? And then program accountability is what almost everybody cares about, but is the hardest to figure out. Does the program achieve its goal as defined in law? Well, like we talked about, there are all sorts of other potential intervening causes that could affect whether or not a program is accountable or whether it has success. Were individuals given the right authority? Were they given financial resources? Were they given human resources? Were they given opportunities? Did they have the right target population? Was there some other intervening variable? There's lots of all that problem that could, lots of potential problems that could affect whether or not a program achieves its goals. So whether or not you're looking at finances or process or whether or not it achieves its goals, most of these sorts of forms of accountability are core in program evaluations, at least in public administration. Okay, we've sort of already talked about these types of evaluations, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but single system research follows one program. Group research often follows two or multiple programs or multiple different organizations that are doing the same sort of program. Client satisfaction is a type of evaluation. Usually that's a component part of another sort of program evaluation. Asking individuals how well they're doing, gathering survey information, either about the people who are involved in the program itself or the people who are being affected by the program. Both of those are satisfaction surveys. One is based on the client and one are based on employee or procedural satisfaction surveys. Quality assurance studies are like audits. And then summative assessments are like what we call outcome evaluations. There's also these other type of evaluations called needs assessment, where you go in and you look at the program, see what's working well, and see where they could find procedural improvements. And we identify those, like where are there critical failures inside this program? How can we make some changes? Then there's all sorts of mixed methods approaches. There's formative and process evaluations, like how did a program come into being? How do we structure up a governing body for this nonprofit? How did we select people to do this sort of thing that creates something that's formative? How do we do those studies to identify like who the target population is, where we have needs in the community? And then other sort of process evaluations are based on this model of like, how are we doing the thing? And is it going to achieve our goal based on how we're doing it? Then other things are like cost analyses. So I think I'm going to click through these pretty fast. George Fredrickson, one of the major PA scholars, says that oftentimes we get client satisfaction surveys really wrong because we think of the people we serve as clients. And in particular, in public administration, the people we serve are not our clients per se. Clients have a choice. If I don't like Walmart, I can go to Target. And if I don't like Target, I can go to Amazon, or there's choice. If I don't like the DMV, I can't go to somewhere else to get a license. I just have to go to the DMV. So the DMV has a monopoly on has a monopoly on its authority. Same thing with a permitting department inside a county. Like, you have authority to issue a permit or not issue a permit, and clients don't get to choose. So when we call people clients, it assumes that there's some sort of market pressure here, and that there are other alternatives. Like when I get an IT survey, guys, I'm on something really quickly. So just hold up for a second. I'm gonna take you on a ride. When I get an IT survey, they say, would you recommend going to the IT department to help with your computer needs? I want to yell at the survey and say, who else would I go to for my campus issued laptop technical support except for the only authorized group who can do that? IT. They're like, you treat me like I'm a client. I'm not a client. I own you. Because, well, maybe not with IT, but like in cities, dude, citizens own cities. They own you. They're your owners. They're not your clients. So when we talk about like client surveys and market models and running PA like a business, no, it doesn't work that way because we have to fundamentally think differently about who we serve. Now, can you do something like a client satisfaction survey? Yes, but procedurally, you have to think about them as not being able to choose any other service to get that job done. They can't do that. So you word your questions differently. You ask different types of questions. You have to rethink it. Okay, so satisfaction surveys often have massive problems. For example, you get higher ratings than you expect. Like when I give students C's because I think that C's are average, all my students are really upset with me because they think that B's and A's are average. So have you taken a client satisfaction survey when you go to the DMV and they're like, how was your experience with the DMV today? And you rate it as like an 8. An 8 is not good at the DMV. You want like a 9 or a 10. You would never rate it as like a 6 because 6 is average. You rate 6 because it's failing, right? So typically people are generous in client satisfaction surveys. So you get a ceiling effect. Most of them tend towards a ceiling, and that's not good. You would never give once again, with this client problem, if you're a police officer or you work in the jails and you ask the people that you're serving as your clients, like whether or not they enjoyed the way you put them in their cell today, whether or not the food tasted good, like maybe you don't really care about that because it doesn't really matter. Like they're going to hate it anyway. And if you did that, let's say for the judicial system, and you're sampling people as they leave the courtroom, how did you like your judge today? Like what kind of information are you going to do with that? The people who won are going to think it's awesome, and the people who lost are going to think it sucks. So you have to just generally get the sense that underlying all of these things, people are people and they behave like people, and you should anticipate that it doesn't work the way you think it will, unless you can think through all the steps. Another thing we find out, speaking in big, broad brush strokes with client surveys, in particular with surveys, is that when you look across different ethnic groups on the same client satisfaction surveys, the averages are different. So I know this for 4 major racial ethnic groups: the Asian, Hispanic, Latino, white, and African American. In big, broad crush strokes, topping in stereotypes from the data, Hispanic individuals generally, Hispanic Latinx individuals generally rate higher on satisfaction surveys overall. African Americans almost always rate lower on average overall in client satisfaction surveys. Asian Americans most often rate harsher or less satisfied on client satisfaction surveys overall, and white people are just the average because we're average or whatever that is. So even though the data are there and they might look a certain way, you need to dig into the literature to see what is typical if you're going to look at client satisfaction. Sorry, a little tangent there. The biggest ones that we talk about are summative assessments. What happens at the end of the program? We can look at direct effects. That's to say what directly happened. How many individuals will be placed in housing? What does their life look like now? How many benefits do they have because of this thing? But there can be also indirect effects, or these are called externalities if you took the policy analysis class or will take it. Sometimes there are non-quantifiable benefits for programs. Say, for example, Riverside used to do the shade tree program, and they would give away free shade trees, because it's going to minimize the amount of electricity that you use, because it creates shade and you have to plant at a certain side of your house, all that stuff, whatever. So you put the shade trees up. After 5 years, You have shade on your house. That's great. Your electric bill is going to go down during the summer. But also now you have a neighborhood that has lots of trees in it, which is cool, right? It looks nice. But that neighborhood is also going to have more infrastructure problems because the trees will probably mess up the pipes in the house, or the water pipes or the sewer pipes. So the direct effect is you get shade on your house, but the indirect effects are positive looking neighborhood, lots of nice big tall trees with shade, and that's inviting and enticing. But also it means that you're going to have foundation cracks, plumbing problems, maybe water line breaks, also externalities. So you have to identify, do you want direct effects? Do you want to look at long-term indirect effects and externalities? Summative assessments also look at inputs and outputs. We took this much money in, we inserted this many individuals in the program, we did this was the outcome, or sorry, the output, these sorts of individuals happened, this sort of thing, we did this sort of thing, we printed this many flyers, we had this many meetings. That's input output. And then some things are just not quantifiable in terms of a cost benefit. It costs this much, these are sort of benefits, but when we're talking about somebody's individual life, that's hard to say, well, you were worth $300,000 and you were worth $100,000, you're worth $500,000. Like, it doesn't really work. So you have to be careful about how we do summative assessments. I think I'm pretty close to the end of the PowerPoint here. We can look at all these different things. Oh, okay. I think that you can find this on another video. Whenever we deal with programs, we have to think about how we're going to measure them and what the effects of, in particular, time are. So time causes all sorts of problems for programs because over time, funding may fluctuate for a program. Over time, we have increased ability to understand the program and our target population. So sometimes that's good, but also we have turnover in terms of staffing and employees. We might have managerial shift towards not doing a certain thing in this type of program and other types of things for other programs. We'll have turnover in terms of how many individuals have experience in that program. Maybe we have new hires in there, maybe we don't. So programs change over time just because people change over time. The other thing is the people we work with change over time and the target population changes. So history matters, where people come from, what organizations, their backgrounds are, their predisposition, that matters. Maturation happens as an individual isn't in a program and they start to anticipate changes, just like even in a placebo effect, because they know something's going to happen. They also can desensitize over time. So let's say we're looking at drug rehab programs. A person knows what kind of questions they're going to get asked in an outpatient therapy, so they can sort of anticipate what's coming, which may bias the sort of truth that they tell. Instrumentation problems, like I talked about before, that at the beginning of a program, we may have a set questionnaire, and we anticipate at the end of the program, they're going to ask the same questions, answer the same questions so we can get the same data. But sometimes those questions and the meaning of those questions change, even if the words don't. Sometimes we measure things in one way and we don't measure them the same way later. So because we measure them differently, we can't compare the data. That's an instrumentation problem. We have testing problems. Every time you interject yourself into a program to try and gather data, individuals who manage those programs react differently. Like they want to put forth your best data because they're afraid that they're going to get cut. They may anticipate what's coming. Like think about high stakes testing for students. All the teachers know that there's like a drop dead time when they have to have all that information that's on the test into elementary students' heads. Then they take the test. And then the rest of the school year is like farting around watching movies. Not completely that way. Why are they spending so much time farting around watching movies? Because at that point, the test was all that mattered. And the rest of the school year is like just to get money from the state. Now, that's not exactly true. There's also some babysitting involved so that parents don't freak out. No, I'm being super cynical here, but ultimately what I'm saying is like the teachers know when the test is going to happen. So they know how they have to prepare the students to hit that one day. Same thing happens in programs. Like program managers know that there's a date by which it's going to be evaluated, and they're going to look their very best on that day because of testing effects. Other things happen like mortality. Some people opt into programs and they opt out of programs based on whether or not the program's working for them. And if people are opting out of the program because the program's not working for them, and you're trying to measure all the participants over time, what you're going to get over time is that as people opt out, your program gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But also all those valuable people who've left, they have perspectives that you're not going to get at that end point in time with all that data. They left for other reasons, but maybe that they left because the program sucked. And so you have 100 people, and let's say 50% of them leave because the program sucked. By the end, you got 50 people who love the program, who think it's awesome. So 100%, which is now 50 out of 50 instead of 50 out of 100, said that the program's awesome because the other 50 thought it sucked and they left. That's a mortality problem. Over time, people drop out. We've got selection problems. We already talked about random selection. And then placebo problems. You already know about those. Over here, we've talked about pre-post and all these different things. These are sort of different setups. R means randomization, O means observation, X means intervention. So you could take, this is just a simple outcome evaluation with a stimulus and an outcome. There's no pre. This one it measures before, intervention, after. And then we have one right here. The next one is OXO and then O underscore O. The underscore means there was no intervention. So we compare this group to this group, OXO to O underscore O. And what we're doing is we're essentially saying, here's a group that had the program. Here's a group that didn't have the program. We're going to compare them over time. This is a longitudinal one with like 4 observations, then an intervention, then 4 observations. Here is the control group comparison. So you'd measure both of those. Or if it was a true experiment, you do some randomization and push them through those things. So what we'll do now is we'll stop the video and we'll start talking about programs. Let me try and stop this recording.